sermon. And in fact, let's not just talk about sermon. Let's talk about my literal favorite story from church history. This is my favorite. This is it's also my favorite tattoo I have. Like it's just my favorite story. It's my favorite. Like it's this thing. Okay, so the Apostle Peter. After he disappears in the Bible, he goes somewhere. Like I think sometimes we don't think about like, the Bible tells a specific story and it tells us the story in a specific way. And sometimes people disappear. And Peter just sort of disappears from the scene in the book of Acts. And it shifts, the first, I think, about 12 chapters of Acts, it's very Peter-centric. Like, it's very much about Peter. Maybe it's about other people, too, but Peter is sort of the main character to that. And then in chapter 12, at that point, the main character becomes Paul, and Peter sort of disappears. Well, church history tells us that what happened was Peter ends up kind of separating himself from the other disciples, the other apostles, the rest of the church, and he goes and he plays the game on hard mode, okay? He goes to Rome, and he sets up a ministry there. And that would have been the hardest place to do ministry. I mean, of all the places, I understand that, like, the Jews were persecuting the church, and I understand that, it was tough everywhere. But Rome was sort of the eye of the storm. They were sort of, it was dangerous. I mean, forget Christianity. It was dangerous to be a Jew in Rome. I mean, the Romans kicked the Jews out, around this time. And so, it wasn't it was a really, really hard place. And the Romans, like, that's where everybody was really committed to their polytheistic way of looking at things and all of that. And so it was, if you're going to do ministry anywhere in the world, at that point in history, Rome was the toughest place. Today, it's probably the easiest place, but back then it was the absolute toughest place. And so for 25 years, that's what Peter does. He has a ministry. He is the leader of the church. He does ministry. We know that he writes a couple letters to the church. We saved those. Those are in the Bible. They're called 1st and 2nd Peter. We're not very good at naming things, but we have that. We know that happened. And so that's what Peter does for like 25 years. And in 64 AD, a man by the name of Nero, who just so happened to be the emperor, decides that he is going to persecute the church. He was a politician more than he was anything else, and things were going bad for him. There was this massive fire, and he was catching all the blame for it. And he, being a politician, wanted to not get blamed for this, and so he looks for a scapegoat. And the Christians were an easy target, right? They were an easy mark because, again, like I just said, the Romans already don't like the Jews. The church is headed up by a Jew, Peter, and most of the church at that point in history was still predominantly Jewish. Not completely, but it was predominantly Jewish. And so the Christians also were kind of weirdos. From the perspective of the Romans, they had some weird religious practices that didn't make any sense. They didn't do some things in religion that, everybody sort of did. And so they were just sort of odd ducks. And, it's easy to scapegoat people who are different and people who are weird, and that's where we ended up with the church being persecuted. And Nero ends up killing Christians horribly and dramatically and in droves and also in really bad ways. Like, we're not just talking crucifixion. We're talking like putting them in the arena with, wild animals. We're talking about like lighting them on fire in the streets and using them as street lights and, just really horrific, terrible things that happened. And Peter ended up being one of those martyrs. Now, the story goes like this. I'm not totally sure why this happens. I don't know why when Peter got around to being killed that, he was allowed to say, hey, could you do it this way instead of that way? But he did. He had a request. He said, hey, I would like to be crucified upside down, if at all possible. And I don't know why, Nero or, whoever it was that was doing this, why they gave into his request. I don't know. Maybe they, hadn't thought of doing that and they thought it was fun. I don't know. Maybe it was just, we're always looking for creative ways. Maybe it was just, as some sort of sick game, it was always, we'll let you choose which manner of death is the worst one, right? I have no idea. But Peter said, I want to be crucified upside down. And the reason we're told in church history is simple. He wanted to die like Christ, but he also, as he died, did not want to completely be like Christ because he knew he was not quite like Christ. Meaning, in an act of humility, he would die for Jesus, but he wanted to separate himself in a message that says, I'm not Jesus. I want to die like Jesus, but not as Jesus. And I think it's beautiful. Because this is really not a story about death at all. It's a story about life. Peter's life is a giant roller coaster. It's up, it's down. It's 1 minute he's saying stuff that Jesus says only God could have revealed to you. Another minute, Jesus calling him Satan. 1 minute, he's ready to fight a whole army for Jesus. Another time, another minute he's being yelled at by Jesus for fighting an army for Jesus, because you're not supposed to fight armies for Jesus. We should stop doing that. 1 minute he has abandoned his post. He is saying, I'm no longer an apostle. I'm going to be a fisherman. The next minute he is telling Jesus 3 times he loves him and he wants to be a disciple again. Peter's whole life is, 1 step forward, 3 steps back, 3 steps forward, 8 steps back. It's his whole life. This is the guy who he doesn't want to baptize Gentiles, but he baptizes the first Romans. And then, it's just this whole thing that Peter's life is like this. And the way that Peter approached his faith was simple. He wanted to be like Christ, but he knew he was never done. He wanted to follow Jesus, but he knew there was always still more work to go through. He knew that he was never a finished product. At no point was he a finished product, because he never quite was the way exactly that Jesus wanted. And so no matter what it was, no matter how close he got, no matter how great his ministry was, no matter how many people he led to Christ, no matter any of that, Peter understood, my life is a journey and it's not done. And even as he was nailed to a cross, inverted upside down, his life was not done. As long as he was breathing, he still had work to do. And that's my favorite story. It's just such a beautiful, beautiful understanding of what it means to be a Christian, a beautiful, convicting thing of we always have next steps. No matter what those steps are, even as we are taking our dying breaths, we are still working towards doing something better than we were before. You might be wondering what that has anything to do with Christmas. Nothing. It has absolutely nothing to do with Christmas. Literally nothing. That a complete red herring to anything. Look, we're at that part of Christmas that it's a really unpleasant part, and I wanted to talk about my favorite thing, because now I got to talk about dead babies, and that's unpleasant. I don't want to talk about it. You don't want to hear it, but it's part of the Christmas story, right? So I thought, we'll start with something I like, and then transition into the stuff I don't. And I don't like this, right? We know, nobody in this room, nobody who might be listening online has any, it's not surprising that we talk about this, because it's in the Bible, it's part of the whole thing, it's right there. It's part of the Christmas story, is that there's, dead babies. And it's interesting. I remember a few years ago, I was reading an article from some theologian with lots of fancy titles and stuff, and he was trying to explain why, this is Herod killing the babies in Bethlehem was not that big of a deal, because we think it's lots of dead babies, but really he went this whole thing about geographically how Bethlehem's not very big and the surrounding areas aren't very big. And he went into population density and birth rates and, how many babies there were to die. And he concluded it wasn't that many babies. And I remember reading this and being I am not comforted by that at all. Because the question of how many dead babies does it take to ruin Christmas, the answer is 1. No, this is unpleasant, and I'm being glib about it, but it's very unpleasant. This is an unpleasant part of the Christmas story. We talk about Christmas story. We got angels. We've got the beautiful Virgin Mary and Joseph's faithfulness, and all the beautiful nativity stuff. But this ugliness is right smack dab in the middle of it. And I guess the question that we should probably ask ourselves on a few different levels is, well, why? Why is this part of the Christmas story? Why is this just there? And I think the immediate answer that we would answer, that everybody would raise their hand and say, is, oh, it's Herod. This is on Herod. This is Herod's fault. Okay. Let's talk about that. So Herod is the one who does this. Herod is the one who decides he's going to kill every child 2 years, male child 2 years and under in Bethlehem, in an attempt to kill Jesus. So that is it. Jesus is born. Herod wants to kill him. That's where the baby's dying comes from. And maybe Herod did that because he's sort of a true believer in Rome. That's possible. It's entirely possible that Herod is just that he is down for the cause. He loves Rome, and that's it. Look, Herod was installed as a king over Israel by the Roman Senate. He only has a job. He only has power. He only has anything because the Romans put him there. Everything comes from them, and it's entirely possible that he is loyal to them, that he is appreciative of them. It's entirely possible that he understands that they put him here, they can take him out, and that's the way that it is. And it's entirely possible that everything he does is in service to Caesar and in service to the empire. And he does some stuff that it really looks like it. Like there's this really famous story where the temple of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, one day everybody tries to go to the temple to worship as they normally do, and they see at the doorway, like as you go into the temple, they see this huge eagle above the door. The eagle being the symbol of Rome, and the eagle specifically being the symbol that is carried into battle by the Roman army. Like if you see a giant eagle somewhere, you know that is Rome planting their flag saying this is ours. And if you see an eagle at a temple, what you're seeing is Rome planting their flag saying, even your religion is ours. Even your faith is ours. There is nowhere you can escape us. We are watching. You belong to us. It was wildly offensive. I mean, it started a whole riot. Like, I mean, the troops had to come in. There's bloodshed. People are dying. It's just a whole massive thing. But all of that was because Herod did it. I don't know that anybody ever told him to. It was just sort of Herod making a point. More dramatically and maybe less well known is Herod actually, Herod is the great builder. He builds all sorts of things. That's sort of what he's known for. Outside of like the Bible, he's known as a guy who just builds lots and lots of stuff. Like he really built up Jerusalem. He built up the area. That's what he does. One of the things he built was a temple in worship of the emperor. Like literally built a church where people could go and give offerings and worship the Caesar. That sure sounds like a guy who is loyal to the emperor, loyal to the empire, loyal to the cause. It's entirely possible that's who Herod was. And that's why, when he hears about Jesus, he needs to kill Jesus because Jesus is a threat to Rome and he believes in the cause. On the other hand, it's entirely possible that Herod found himself between a rock and a hard place, and Herod was just trying to survive. You see, there's this thing in the Bible, and I think sometimes we don't read the story because it's unpleasant. And we're talking about Christmas, we just talk about other stuff. But there's this part of the Bible that it talks about, when Herod finds out that Jesus has been born and people are calling him the King of the Jews and all that. It says that Herod is disturbed by that, along with all of Israel. Meaning, it's not just Herod that's afraid or upset or angry or whatever. It is lots of people who are upset, afraid, angry at this whole idea. And that comes from fear. You see, if you're going to live under Roman law, if you're going to live under the jurisdiction of the Romans, the name of the game is survival. The name of the game is don't fight those guys because everyone who fights those guys loses. And so that's the whole thing is you don't want to revolution is the last thing anybody wants. And a baby king means revolution. I'm not sure we all totally understand this when we think about why Jesus ends up dying we know the story doesn't actually get it there, but at the beginning, but he dies 30 years later, and Jesus dies because of that. We're told in the book of John that Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. And that's such a dramatic miracle. Everybody sees it. Everybody hears it. Everybody knows what that means. Everybody knows that that's a power that nobody else can do. And the Sanhedrin, the Jewish court, ends up deciding to kill Jesus out of fear of Rome. They don't kill Jesus. We often wonder, why are they so mad at Jesus? It's not even that they're mad at Jesus. They're afraid of what will happen if the people rise up behind Jesus. They say Rome's going to come in, they'll crush us. Jesus is killed by the Sanhedrin out of fear of Rome. It's entirely possible that Herod kills the babies in Bethlehem out of fear of Rome, not loyalty to Rome. It's entirely possible that that's what it is. And Herod is stuck between a rock and a hard place. All Herod is trying to do is protect his people, is keep his people alive, is do the bare minimum to keep revolution at hand so that way, people can live. It's possible. We don't really know. What we know is Herod is the one who says, all right, if there's a baby that's born and they're saying that he's the king of the Jews, they're saying he's the Messiah, and they're saying all these things, people are saying that angels are around, and people are saying they're following a star, and we're all if that's what people are saying, then we got to kill him. And so he sends the troops in to kill every baby. He doesn't know which one it is, so all right, we'll just kill every single male baby 2 and under. That'll cover it. It's a blanket thing. One of them's got to be him. And they send him into Bethlehem, where, Mary and Joseph were, and Jesus. This is what ends up happening, however. This is why it gets spoiled. This is good news. It feels like we should, in the midst of this bleak conversation, have a little bit of good news. This is what we read in the Gospel according to Matthew. It says, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. Get up and flee to Egypt with the child and his mother. The angel said, stay there until I tell you to return, because Herod is going to search for the child to kill him. That night, Joseph left for Egypt with the child and Mary, his mother, and they stayed there until Herod's death. This fulfilled what the Lord had spoken through the prophet, I called my son out of Egypt. Again, this is one of those things we don't talk about a whole lot and as we picture things in our head, but we should. Jesus was in Egypt for years. And he was there at first as a refugee. He was there at first, escaping, seeking political asylum, we might call it. The king is after him, and Herod has the ability to go all over Israel. There's nowhere he can't touch. So you go to another country, right? And there's a big Jewish community there. There's Egypt is a place, outside of being the poetic thing of, the Jews start in Egypt. It's kind of a neat thing that the Jews started in Egypt. The Exodus happens, they come home. So the Messiah starts in Egypt, has an Exodus, come home. There's beautiful symmetry and poetry and prophecy there. But we don't have to think about Jesus, at least, we don't know. A couple years, 5 years. Some people have even said up to 10 years, depending on how we date things. Jesus and his family live in Egypt. And that's his upbringing, is Egypt. Because they're hiding from Herod. And it works. Herod dies, they come home, they've forgotten all about it. Jesus is able to have the ministry that he has later on. That's good news. That's sort of neat. However, everything we've said up to this point is not really the answer as to why this happened. It's really not. I'm not trying to let Herod off the hook. That guy's awful. Whatever his reasons, whether his reasons are loyalty or fear, either way, he's out here killing babies. That's terrible. He shouldn't do that. The real reason the babies died is because of the wise men. They're the ones that did this. And I'm not trying to be harsh, but we need to tell the truth here. So we know the wise men. They are not kings. That was a medieval myth that comes out. However, I got to be honest, We Three Kings, it's just so much better in the song than We Three Wise Men. We Three Magi from Orient are, come on. That's terrible. So we call them kings. There's also way more than 3 of them, but whatever. They had 3 gifts, and look, you guys know all that. It's fine. But the Magi, they're Zoroastrian priests from Persia, we think. Right? That we're pretty sure. And their religion was monotheistic-ish, pretty close to monotheism, at least, pretty close to what the Jews were. They had some, idiosyncrasies, of course, as we all do, but they understood, and what really makes them stand out is they really merged scripture with astrology. It's fascinating. The Bible tells us astrology is bad, and then Jesus is born, and God's like, here, have astrology, enjoy. It's kind of weird, but it's something to kind of think over. What God maybe is not quite so rigid as we think, but regardless, they follow this star, and they're like, hey, we see this brand new king. They recognize him before most Jews do. They recognize he must be the new king, the Messiah. It's possible they even believe he's divine, because they're out. They want to worship him. Whatever they believe. I don't know exactly what their theology would have been with God in the flesh, but they're here to worship the baby. And so they go on this giant journey, this long journey. We always think on camels. I don't know how long. I don't know if they had camels, but it's fun to think about because camels make a really good shape when you have the art, and like you can have like the night sky and the star and just have a little silhouette of the guys with the crowns and the camels. It's wonderful. If they walked, not nearly as cool. So they're on their camels, we're just going to say, and they're on their way. And they go, it's funny, the star is leading them to Bethlehem eventually. But the star is sort of like GPS in the early days. You guys remember when you had like a Garmin in like 2004? And it was almost less helpful than it was helpful? Because it only knew like an eighth of the roads. And so you're like on this road in this town, and the Garmin's like, dude, you're on the moon. We have no idea where you're at. And you're like, I spent $300 on this thing. They're like, well, you got to update. And then you go to update it, and it's like, well, we don't know what those maps are. Every day you've got to update this thing, and it never gives you information. That's sort of the star, because the star doesn't take them to Bethlehem first. They go to Jerusalem first, and they see Herod first. And they're like, hey, Herod, we're here to hang out with his baby. I'm sure you're hanging out with him. I'm sure y'all are worshiping him. We just want to worship him with you. And Herod, at that moment, learned, he was that day old when he learned that Jesus had been born and that people were calling him the Messiah, the king of the Jews. Here's what we have to understand. If the wise men keep their mouth shut, Herod doesn't kill the babies. Herod doesn't know anything that's happening until the wise men show up. Herod is the second domino. The first domino is the wise men. This entire incident is predicated on people who don't know who not to talk to. People who don't know when to keep their mouths shut. People who have no idea about the geopolitical atmosphere they're walking into. The wise men were decidedly not wise. And so they walked in, they let the cat out of the bag, and babies die. Now, you might be thinking I'm being a little too harsh. You might think that's not very nice to blame that on the Magi. They didn't mean to, and that's true. They did not mean to. They had the best of intentions. They were trying to do the right thing, and they were assuming Herod also was trying to do the right thing. There's not a single bone in the body of any wise man, any Magi ever that wanted any bad thing to happen, much less babies dying. And you know how much any of that matters? None. Their intentions mean nothing. What they were trying to do means nothing. The Magi might as well have killed the babies themselves. And they didn't mean to at all. There's a vital lesson there. It's not a pleasant one, but it's one we need to learn. You can do everything right, and it blows up in your face. You can have the best of intentions, and nothing goes right. You can want to help, and all you do is hurt. Like, absolutely, you can be a literal saint We can write songs about you in church history and sing them on Sunday morning. And you can still be responsible for the deaths of people because you messed up. We live in a world of volcanoes and mushrooms. It's scary, guys. It's scary out there. It's uncertain, you know? Like you eat a mushroom, you're like, which one is this? Is it going to be a delightful trip to open my mind? Or is it going to kill me? You don't really know until you take that bite. That's the way the world works. The world works like this. I'm pretty sure that's a mountain. Nope, it exploded and I'm dead. That's the way the world is. The whole world wants to kill us. And the reality is, in this world, where it's dangerous and it's fearful and it's uncertain, man, you can do everything right and it come back wrong. That's the reality of the world we live in. And now we're ultra bleak on our Christmas sermon. So the babies die in Bethlehem because the wise men want to do the right thing and it blows up in their face. So here's the question. What do we learn from that? Let's start with more of the Christmas story. This is what we read again in the gospel according to Matthew. This is what we see about the wise men. It says, after this interview, after they talked to Herod, after this interview, the wise men went their way. And the star they had seen in the east guided them to Bethlehem and went ahead of them, and it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were filled with joy. They entered the house and saw the child with his mother, Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasure chests, and they gave him gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. When it was time to leave, they returned to their own country by another route, for God had warned them in a dream not to return to Herod. Let's talk about the good parts of the wise men. The wise men get what they want. They want to see the baby. They want to worship the baby. They get to do that. They're part of our nativity scenes. They weren't all there together. Again, it's a condensed, artistic picture of that. But they were some of the first people to worship the baby. They were some of the first people to worship Jesus. That's amazing. They're not Jewish. They're Gentiles. Jesus is being worshipped by Gentiles immediately. That's amazing. They get to offer their gifts to Jesus. That's amazing. If you ever wonder how Jesus was able, Mary and Joseph were able to go to Egypt and live for years, well, they got a bunch of valuable stuff from the wise men who undoubtedly didn't know what they were doing, but they were bankrolling that trip. They were bankrolling that time. If they were there for, the better part of a decade, they needed every ounce of gold and myrrh and frankincense that they had. That's amazing. High five to the wise men. That's exactly what they wanted. And God honors that. God honors that. The star still guided them. God gave them in a dream, don't go back to Herod, just go home. Herod's going to kill you too, just go home. God honors and protects and blesses the wise men, even though their actions had caused a terrible tragedy. What that means is very simple. When it comes to the opinion of God, it doesn't much matter what the outcome of our actions is. If God cared about outcomes, God would have been livid with the wise men for doing what they did because babies died. But the truth of the matter is God is not livid with the wise men. God honors the wise men. God is pleased with the wise men because all that was in control of the wise men was their actions. They couldn't control anything else. And God did not expect them to try to control anything else. It's a very simple point that gets lost in a world of volcanoes and mushrooms. You are only responsible for you. That's it. You only control you. You do the right thing. That's all that matters. What comes from it on the back end may be good, may be bad. It may be wonderful, it may be tragedy. It may go exactly the way you want, it may go exactly the way you didn't want. You are not in control of that. The Magi, the wise men, had no control over what Herod was going to do. They had no control over what the troops were going to do. They had no control over anything in Bethlehem. They had control over their actions, and they did the right thing, and God honored that. All God expects from us, and this is kind of a big ask, what God expects from us is to control what we do. And what anybody else is doing, that's on them. It's about what we do. Because the reality is, that's the way it has to be. We cannot possibly control what other people do. We cannot possibly control how other people think or act or respond to us. All we can control is us. So we do the right thing, and that's what God wants. Now, as it turns out, there's more to say. It's like, we're driving the same point home again and again. But as it turns out, that story from the beginning that I said was unrelated, at this point, it becomes related. You see, I told you before, Story Peter is my favorite story in church history. And it is, but I haven't really told you exactly why yet. Okay. So there's these church historians who tell us we don't usually have exact dates, right, for anything, but and we didn't usually even whittle it down. But in this case, church historians tell us some pretty exact dates. We can date it from when somebody else started their reign, right? Like, and we're not totally sure, but we can knock it down to about 2 years. Here's what I mean. Peter dies on a cross, upside down, either in 67 AD or 68 AD. One of those two. We know for sure, 100%, inarguably, 67 to 68 AD. Some of you guys right now are putting together something I told you earlier. Nero begins persecuting the church in 64 AD, which means Peter dies 3 or 4 years later after the persecution begins, which means Peter had 3 or 4 years to hide. He had 3 or 4 years to run. He had 3 or 4 years with all of his connections in the church, all of his connections in the ancient world. This is Jesus' best friend. He has connections all over everywhere. He could have gone anywhere, and he has 3 or 4 years to do anything else besides die. And Peter chose no. Peter decided he was responsible for him. And he was the Bishop of Rome. He's the guy in charge of this church. That's what he's going to do. And I don't care what Nero says. I don't care what Nero does. I don't care what happens. Peter realized he was responsible for him, not anybody else. So Peter just kept going. He just kept doing ministry. He just kept being Peter. And eventually he died. Peter did not let even the threat of death change him. Peter did not let even Nero, one of the great monsters of world history and church history, stop him from being who he was. That's the lesson of the wise men. It's the wise men's fault that people die. Not because they meant to, not because they did anything morally wrong, and not because they did anything ethically wrong, not because they even knew it was going to happen, but they are first domino. But also, they did the right thing. And at the end of the day, we live in a world of fear. We live in a world of violence. We live in a world of uncertainty. I have no idea what tomorrow brings. But what I know is that tomorrow, I have a choice to make. Will I live my life as a man of honor? Will I live my life as a person following Christ? Will I live my life doing the right thing anywhere and everywhere I can do it, or will I not? That I can choose. I can't choose what happens on the back end of that. The wise men couldn't choose. Peter couldn't choose. The reality is we are all going to die. You will die. This is not going to go according to plan for any of us. Like, you're planning on not dying. You're going to die. So what you can do between now and then is control what you have under your control. And what you can control is following Christ, being a person of honor, doing the right thing no matter what, regardless of what anybody else is doing. It's a tough, bleak lesson from the wise men. And yet also, they may well be our greatest example of all the people that we talk about. Shepherds, Mary and Joseph, the wise men may well be our best example. Because they lived a real life. It did go bad. But God honored and blessed them because they did what they could control. They did the right thing no matter what. Like Peter, 60 years later, and like us, hopefully today. So we're in our third week of our series called Volcanoes and Mushrooms. There'll be a fourth week, and we'll see it next week on Christmas morning. Some of us will. I'll post it online. You'll watch it later. It'll be fine. And as we talk about the wise men, we talk about Herod, unpleasantness, we talk about Peter, we learn this lesson. Our third lesson for this Christmas is this. We never control outcomes. We only control our choices, and we hope in God's mercy for the rest. We never control outcomes. We only control our choices, and we hope in God's mercy for the rest. Singers are going to sing. We offer an invitation. You guys know that. There's a baptistry. If you guys want to do that, I'm looking here. Everybody knows this, so probably don't need to go totally into that. We're going to sing a song, and if you've got something to talk about, let's talk later on. And let's be people who choose the right thing, knowing what we can control, and letting go of what we can't. As we stand,